ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud. It stands tall. And most important, it stands free.
U.S. President Joe Biden in Poland delivering a major speech on Russia's war in Ukraine nearly a year after it began. And Biden declares that NATO is more united than ever and says the U.S. and its allies will continue to stand alongside Ukraine and neighboring nations against Russian aggression. For more on this, we have reached former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchison, who's in Dallas, Texas. Ambassador Hutchison, thank you so much for making time for us.
You bet. It's very good to be with you. Canada has been a wonderful ally at NATO and throughout our joint histories.
Appreciate that, Ambassador. Let me ask you this, because it has been many decades since an American president had to make a speech in Europe during wartime in Europe. And I wonder what moved you the most about what President Biden had to say, or even surprised you?
Well, first of all, you can never reassure the Europeans enough that we are here, we are united, and we will stick through this horrible war of aggression by Russia until the end. That was the main theme, and it was very strong. The other things that I noticed, of course, was President Biden talking to the Russian people to refute what Putin had just said in his State of the State message, which is this was a war created by the West. The West wants to defeat Russia. Well, of course, that is absurd. And the President Biden said to the Russian people, we didn't start this war. No one wants a war with Russia. We want to live in peace. Our sovereign countries, our democracies want to live in peace with our neighbors. So I think that was a good message. And I think if you put together President Putin saying he is going to withdraw from the START treaty, which is, of course, the nuclear treaty that we had, that the U.S. had with Russia, and then you put in all the other rhetoric. Putin is trying to make a domestic case that this is a war against Russia, which of course is the opposite. It's a war of aggression by Russia against a Ukraine sovereign nation.
Let's dig into that a bit more, if you would, Ambassador, because you're right. So much of the speech was NATO specific, that NATO has never been stronger. And in fact, the president ended the speech by emphasizing that next year he's going to host his NATO allies in the United States in 2024. 75 years of the NATO treaty and the deal. Article 5 is as strong as it's ever been. He called it rock solid. But Ukraine itself, of course, is not a part of NATO. And I wonder, when and if this thing ends, does that shift? And does Ukraine have a stronger argument to be a member of NATO? Or does that now make it less appealing for NATO to include Ukraine?
Oh, I think that when all of this is over, we will certainly have a Marshall Plan type situation with Ukraine to try to help rebuild Ukraine. But also, I think that Ukraine is going to put the systems in place to try to become a member of the EU and NATO. And I think at some point that will happen. We do want to have Ukraine. They have been a partner for a long time with NATO. And of course, as you know, many of all of our teams have tried to train the Ukraine army, which is why part of the success that they are having is that they are well trained. But it is important that Ukraine put in place the anti-corruption measures that they were working on to then become a part of EU and NATO. And I think everyone wants to have that happen.
Talk to me, if you would, about the significance of President Biden going to Kyiv and being seen in the streets of the capital side by side with President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I think it is a very, very important message. It is a historic trip that was taken. These images of former presidents and now President Biden going to a country and doing something significant, like President Reagan did, like President Bush has done, President Roosevelt, now President Biden, is doing something that will be historically remembered, going to Kyiv, walking the streets while the sirens are going off, and it will be memorable. And most certainly it was a message to the Ukrainian people that we are solid and we will be there. And I think that Ukrainian people deserve to have this kind of message, and I'm sure it was uplifting for the people and certainly for President Zelensky.
Before I let you go, Ambassador, as we approach the one-year anniversary of the war, one of the things that stood out for some of us from the Biden speech was the humanity or lack of humanity in this warfare. And he talked about not only what the Russian military has done, but those mercenary groups like the Wagner Group, and just that list of crimes against humanity, using rape as a weapon of war, the bombing of schools, the bombing of maternity wards in hospitals, children being stolen from their homes to be sent to re-education camps. In all the discussion about NATO and policies and speeches, the humanity of what is happening on the ground, I wonder if you could reflect on that a bit for us.
Well, for sure. It's the most atrocious number of violations of humanity that I have ever seen. And to have it happen in 2022 and 23 is incredible, when we all know what rules of engagement should be if you have a disagreement. And the atrocities that you have mentioned are unspeakable, clearly war crimes, but I don't think Putin cares about war crimes. I don't think he even thinks in terms of a rules-based order or humanity or humanitarian concerns. When he goes before his people, after he has enlisted 500,000 civilians to come in and join this war that he has not made a case for, which they do not care about, has caused a brain drain in his own country. He is a leader that is just almost working against his own country, against his own legacy, against all of what normal people would want for their lives, like a freedom, the ability to live and raise families. And President Putin seems not to care, as he is just taking 18 and 20-year-olds out of whatever they're doing and saying, you must go and fight this war for Mother Russia. Well, they're not fighting for Mother Russia. They're fighting against a sovereign nation that is fighting for its survival. And it's a terrible thing. It is clearly war crimes. He will pay the price in a legacy of atrocities, just like Stalin before him.
Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, thank you so much for your time, ma'am.
Thank you.